Welcome to Urbanism Vancouver, a podcast that explores how our built environment shapes our everyday lives and community experiences. I'm your host, Helen Lui. Join me as we discover where we live, work, and play, and how we can shape better communities. With each episode, we'll bring a bit of insight and industry experience from myself and my guests. We'll dive into the inner workings of our urban surroundings and explore how places are planned, designed, and built, and discuss ways to create more livable, equitable, and sustainable cities. I hope that you'll learn a little and be inspired to be more curious and more involved in impacting positive change. Before we get started today, we want to acknowledge that this podcast is recorded and produced on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize the enduring connection they have to this land. We strive to have our conversations contribute towards reconciliation and work towards sustainability and equity for all the custodians of the lands. Does our built environment have the ability to impact our happiness? And if so, is there a science behind it? Or is it a subjective value that's focused on aesthetics? Today, we continue our conversation from the previous episode with Houssam Elokda to learn more about how to make our cities happier.
So, the very simple answer, happiness, the technical description of it, is subjective well-being. So when someone looks at us like snarkily and they're like, happiness is subjective, yes, that is the point. Happiness, basically, the simple way to measure it is to ask someone, how happy do you feel right now? And people who report high means that they rate high on happiness. And what the research tells us is that people who rate themselves higher on happiness actually do better off on all of the objective measures that governments tend to care about. For us, it's a shift in focus from trying to predict what will be good for people to focusing not just on people's experiences of what is good for them, but also a deeper focus on how they feel. So in a sense, we consider it an inherently democratic approach because it centers the human experience on how we feel about changes that are going on in our cities. The only way to measure it now is a little bit of a brute way of just asking as many people as you can, how happy do you feel right now? Right. And when we do this, what we focus on is not just how happy do I feel in the moment, but it's sustained long-term happiness. So we're asking people how happy they feel about their life in general, all things considered. So that's kind of like as simple of a definition as I can give. But really, once you break it down, the World Happiness Report, which is the biggest kind of global investigation in this concept of happiness, and they measure happiness for all countries across the world and do like surveys of thousands of people. What they kind of have boiled it down is it tends to correlate with things like trust in your community, perceptions of corruption, healthy life years, and many other things. I think like if you really want to dive into it, you can look through the reports. But for us, it is really a crystallization of what we think is super important for cities and for governments and their approach to cities is the shift from making assumptions about what people's experiences are and focusing deeper on what they say their experiences are, but also trying to understand how they feel about things. And I think that's what separates our approach to thinking about happy cities and what appealed to so many people as like, this could just be the one thing that we should hyper-focus on because below it is an umbrella of a lot of all the other things that we talk about as important for our cities.
I have a couple questions related to that. Well, first of all, I didn't even know that there was an organization or like this work that is being done across the world to quantify happiness of people in different countries.
Yeah.
Secondly, is you mentioned that your team is trying to shift the work from what people think are good to create kind of happier cities to relying on like a more people-focused approach of asking people, their actual experience. Can you give us a tangible example of something that's done that first way versus the second?
I can give you an example. It's not an example that would capture the experiences of the general populations when it comes to happiness, but it's one that stuck out with me a lot. Part of our initial work was creating our own kind of framework for happiness, or urban happiness at least, the things that we look for in an urban environment that we know correlate to happiness. And we've had this framework for years, and it has, it's usually been our starting point, and then we take it and we adapt it to each project. But one project that we did with the Luma Native Housing Society, that was mostly led by my colleagues, it was really interesting because this was temporary modular housing that's on the Heatherlands, owned and operated by the Luma Native Housing Society. And for listeners who don't know, temporary modular housing is like housing that's kind of mostly put together offsite and then assembled on site, and it's temporary because the land is going to be redeveloped into a mixed-use community. So the plan was for it to be there only for a limited number of years. And the focus of this building was to help Indigenous people transitioning out of homelessness. And our challenge was we did a CMHC-funded study to try and understand what are the actual design implications of this building and how it affects their well-being. What are the programming implications of the programs that they run and how it impacts their well-being? But the first question we asked was, what does well-being mean to you? And the responses we heard made us basically take our original well-being framework and completely redefine it, because the experience and what well-being means, what happiness means for people who experienced a lot in their lives was very different. And what we heard from them was that at the core of the painful experience of being homeless was the loss of dignity that they felt. Like, dignity was something that kept coming up and up as a core thing. Right next to it was social trust. They said that the thing that hurt them most is not that they couldn't find a place to sleep, it's that everyone treated them as social pariahs. Is that they lost the trust of people in their community, of people in their neighborhoods, of people on the street. So when you hear that, and then you realize the challenge, the aspiration, is helping them transition out of homelessness into stable housing, stable and thriving lives, fixing that situation, helping them regain the sense of dignity that was stripped from them, and build a sense of trust amongst themselves and amongst other people, is the core goal that housing interventions are supposed to do. And when we approach housing from a perspective of, here is how many units we will provide, again, important, but it doesn't see the full picture. So we found through this work that the amenity spaces that were part of this building were so crucial to their connections to their well-being, just as crucial as the unit and the roof over their head was. That the work that was done by the program managers at Luma Native Housing Society was immensely important in helping rebuild these elements of dignity and trust. And for me, it was one of those changing experiences because it just highlighted why this approach is really important and highlighted where decision makers get things wrong. Is often by misunderstanding the problem that they need to fix or the challenge that they need to address.
Yeah, that's a really great example. I agree with you completely that a lot of times when we are thinking about new buildings and new developments, a lot of it has buzzwords of what the intended outcome is, like you said, well-being, but then it immediately gets into like a lot of prescriptive things that are very top down, that maybe aren't flexible with the unique nature of every development. And your example of letting people define what that means, I think is so powerful and important, and gives them a bit more agency and control over like how that can proceed, right?
I think it also, for me, it's a shift in understanding what our responsibility as people who contribute to city builders are, and the impact that the decisions we make, the effort that we put today has on our cities. Unfortunately, I think not a lot of people realize these connections. We have an immense responsibility as myself, an urban planner, but this applies to all of the urbanism industries, architects, developers, policymakers, and we get to shape how people interact with the built environment on a daily basis. Doing our job well means positive impact that lasts for decades. And unfortunately, the opposite is also true. And if all of us, I think at the very least, understand that sense of responsibility, it changes the effort and the attention that you put in to the details that you work on every day.
It also sounds like by focusing on the people to help define, those outcomes, it can get a little bit messy and it can get a little bit subjective. And I could see where in our industry, people don't like that. They don't like the idea that every project might have a different way of approaching something depending on what the user group is. And this is where I feel like in a place like Vancouver, where you have a lot of diverse cultures and backgrounds, the things that people value for their well-being can even vary depending on how they grew up and their childhood and cultural influences. So having a more, I call it like a performance-based approach rather than like a prescriptive list of what these things are. And I'm telling you, like, you have to do these 10 things. I agree that we should be shifting it towards the approach that you have highlighted. I guess the other question I have is, you're talking about the relationship between how people quantify their happiness as a relation to the built environment. But because it's so subjective, how do we know what portion of that is due to the built environment and like not these other factors, right? Because you could do all this research.
Like, I lost my job today.
Yeah.
I don't feel very happy.
Or I won the lottery, right? And it has nothing to do with my built environment. So how do you quantify, okay, well, this is the impact of doing this thing in our built environment, which increases, people's happiness?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of taking out these, let's call it them, the outlier situations, not everyone lost their job today or not everyone had a breakup yesterday. The main way we ensure that doesn't skew the data is by asking more people. So, you have to get to a certain sample size to actually be able to say, like, this is representative of the general population of this area. Determining which portions are attributable to the built environment and which portions are just about like general life, like, there's a pandemic, there's a lot of things that play into factor, is really about doing your best to control the comparisons. So, when we do our surveys, our well-being surveys, or we look at some research, you try to keep all things equal. I'm not comparing an apartment building in Canada with a row house or, a walk-up in Cairo. There are going to be very different reasons why people will report happiness. You're comparing as much as you can people who live within the same communities, in the same times of the year, the same times of day if you can, and trying to understand, okay, without changing, with controlling all else equal,
right?
As much as we can, we try to only change the built environment elements and see if they correlate. And in the end, you don't get the full picture. You will never fully be able to take out all the noise, but doing it over and over at bigger and bigger scales in different settings, you start to see patterns. And the research that's been done all over the world on these correlations between happiness and urban design, they are bringing out consistent patterns of what people need to thrive in urban environments. And that investigation at that scale is what starts to show you an accurate picture of what people need to thrive in these environments. And the interesting thing is, it's really funny, as humans, we spend a considerable amount of effort understanding what is good habitat for like almost every single living organism out there, except humans. Like we have a very good idea of what bees need to to thrive, and that's really important. Go bees. But we have a lack in understanding what is good human habitat. And that is more or less a core part of what we try to understand with our work.
I then asked Houssam for some specific building design features that can increase social interactions in order to promote happiness and well-being within our cities.
So, assuming you're already in a walkable neighborhood, which thankfully a lot of Vancouver and Metro Vancouver and areas near transit are, I'm speaking to a developer who's building a building now, because like when you go into the building scale, you want to create the same effect that we discussed, like repeated interactions with a limited number of people. And the way the building is designed has a huge impact on that. One thing that we found with our study is that buildings that had higher quality and just, more amenity spaces were more likely to report stronger social connections, stronger trust amongst neighbors. And obviously, most cases, developers are required to build amenity spaces, but the way it's been done sometimes is like, let's check off this box. Let's put the amenity space in the corner we want the least because it's not productive space. And I understand the financial constraints. So think about it like this. We use a lot of common spaces on a daily basis in our building. Most of the ones that we use by default, by necessity, like our hallways, our lobbies, our garbage rooms even, our parking lots, whatever it is, are not optimized for social interaction. They are transition spaces that you go through as fast as possible to get to somewhere else. We found that actually interventions to improve these spaces have the highest return on social interactions because people are forced to use them. So when someone's already walking through the hallway, giving them an opportunity to maybe sit down and not feel like a weirdo is a great way to get people outside. Because what happens today in apartment buildings, people leave their unit, they walk as fast as they can to the elevator, they get into the elevator and they pray that no one joins in the elevator. And if the elevator is crowded, you just like stare to the ceiling and hope that no one farts or something. and you get out of there as fast as possible. And this is an example of like the opposite of encouraging people to interact, because people don't build relationships when they have no opportunity to meet other people, but they also shut off when they feel overcrowded, when they feel like they have no control over their environment. So the key element of encouraging social interaction is creating spaces where they can interact, but also giving them control, which is why like porches are really strong, which is why well-designed lobbies, even nooks in your hallways or corridors are really important. Just whatever excuse for people to stop, slow down, and exist in a common area is how you move people from just experiencing life in private settings of their home, of work, of etc., and moving that to the common spaces in their communities. People are less and less meeting people in their community. They're more likely building friendships around work. They're building friendships around activities, and they're not building these stable community relationships that the research is finding is so important to guaranteeing a better future for ourselves.
So when you talk about some of those spaces for social interaction, clearly in the way that we design apartments now, like all of the things you explained, those are things that I do. Like I take the exit stair because I don't want to go into the elevator. Like I'm like, I got stuff to do. I just want to go and like do it. So do you think that is also then tied with like the sense of feeling lonely, because in the spaces where you have limited social interaction, you don't have control, so you're avoiding that interaction, and then therefore you might be surrounded by people, but you're still feeling lonely? Is that kind of related?
the funny thing of loneliness is a feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's feeling that you don't have the support you need in life, or that you don't have someone to go to if something happens, or no one's checking in on you. It's actually different than like isolation. Isolation is like, I'm physically isolated from people. So you could very well be surrounded by people and feel lonely. It's in some ways more sad. But at the same time, we know that loneliness is becoming a growing crisis in North American cities, but in Vancouver specifically. There was a time before the housing crisis got really crazy that Vancouverites, their number one challenge was loneliness more than housing affordability. This was probably pre-2015.
Okay.
But the housing crisis was still very much there. Right. It was number two, but social isolation and loneliness were number one. And when you think about the way we set up our environments, it's not really a surprise, because the spaces to interact are not intentionally created in our urban environments. It's changing, but it's not done in a consistent way.
I'm trying to think about like, how do we get there? Because right now, our policies with regards to urban development, especially in denser places, really incentivize squeezing every dollar out of the development. And we can argue if that's like capitalism, or if that's because of, you know...
but it's reality.
Yeah, it's reality, right? So when you talk about the importance of these spaces of social interaction, giving enough space for people to feel control, yeah, I can agree with all of that. But how can we actually drive those outcomes if currently people are just incentivized to like, I can't build that, I need that space to be a profitable unit space?
Yeah, so a few things. First of all, on the wider areas of action that we can do, what the research is showing us is actually that one of the strongest predictors of poor social relationships is the proportion of people who leave their houses in a car as opposed to on foot or by bike or by transit. Conceptually, this makes sense. You know, if you're walking from your home to the end of the block and you bump into a neighbor you recognize, you're much more likely to like at least pause and acknowledge them. I mostly live in Halifax, and I come between Halifax and Vancouver. There's a phenomenon in Halifax called like the pedestrian foot traffic. You know, like you could be going from one place to the other, and you are late for your meeting because you keep bumping into people you know, and you feel awkward to just be like, bye, you know? So encouraging people to take more trips on foot or by bike or by walking, rolling, or taking transit is a crucial first step. The next part is when we're designing the buildings. Okay, how can we encourage developers, you know, housing providers in general, to create these spaces within their buildings, create the common spaces, and actually put an effort into programming them, into encouraging residents to connect, and into all of that? That's a question that we have been dissecting for the past few years with our Happy Homes projects and our work with the Hey Neighbor Collective. And most recently, we've actually been like working with 6 municipalities across Metro Vancouver to try and identify these solutions. And a lot of them are taking this and hopefully creating their own work. But I think for me, the biggest inspiration comes from North Vancouver, who did many years ago, actually, their active design guidelines for buildings. And what these were basically saying, listen, developers, if you design these, you know, stairwells, courtyards, hallways to these specifications, we are going to give you density bonuses for them, or basically remove their calculation from your floor area ratio. If you provide, you know, like these types of communal spaces or community gardens, etc., we will, you know, give you these benefits. And they had a very high uptake for these. I think over 90% of applications that came in after the policy was put in place, it took at least one of the design elements in these guidelines and implemented them. And recently, our team actually did a study of North Van, the buildings that went through the active design guidelines. And we found that the biggest success was in these buildings when how people used lobbies the primary stairs and rooftop amenities, these were the ones that yielded the best results. That developers appreciated the ability to receive the floor area exclusions for these shared amenities with the flexibility of figuring out how to provide them. And that residents who lived in these active design buildings, they shared positive experiences around spending time and connecting with neighbors and connecting with each other in these shared spaces. So the experience of people who lived them was positive. The experience of the developers was positive. That was like really a first step. I think the city of North Vancouver tried to like do something that will be implementable and doable. And I think there's inspiration to take from there. We've already worked with another municipality in BC to create an expanded version of something similar, design guidelines for multifamily buildings that are incentive based. So they are not, developers do not have to build them. But if they do, they will get benefits. And the planning department matches the benefits to how much they want this intervention to happen. You really want nice common spaces? Okay, give them more incentives. That way, developers, they can decide, okay, I'm going to create like a really nice courtyard. On the other side, maybe that means that the city is going to give you more rentable density that can offset these costs, or even, more than offset in some cases. So I think like that's just one example, right? Like one example of like, okay, we've identified that the problem is financial. Cities luckily have, some power in these situations to incentivize these things. So, once you look into the problem, the solution can show itself if you're very intent on solving it.
I think the challenge will come from how much do they want it compared to a lot of the things that are already written as either requirements or guidelines, like parking. I know we keep coming back to parking, but parking is the thing that seems to be, we've been tweaking it. There's lots of different things you can do to argue reductions or argue, if you live near a SkyTrain station, you can do this fewer stalls, but there really hasn't been like a real shift in the way we approach it. Like you said, we always have parking minimums, and that's always like a baseline. So how do we balance incentives? And to me, I would much rather prioritize those things than, like your setback or how many stalls, right? Like, I just feel like there has to be trade-offs. And it's a matter of like, how do we as a society decide, okay, these are the values that we need to prioritize and actually instead put as bylaws or requirements instead of these other things that are no longer proving to provide well-being or happiness, right?
It's funny, whenever we start a project like that, where we're just like, we're coming with a very specific direction. We want you to create a policy that does this. We always like push our clients to start by tell me what your core kind of principles are here. Even if they feel it's excessive, we try to make it happen because we come back to these things. When push comes to shove, at the technical details, we come back to the elements of say, okay, you said that you value resilience and equity and connectedness. This is where it's coming to be, where you get to live your values out in the right way. And that conversation, most of the people we work with want to do the best thing that they can do. And it's the tensions of, reality, of different interests and everything that make people, like kind of veer towards the default of the expectation of what's expected, what's normal, and setting exactly the transformation you want to do, visualizing that from the beginning is how you can push back as much as realistically possible to change the future, right? Like this is what we're talking about. We are all dreaming this new future where housing is more affordable, where housing is social, where people know their neighbors. It seems so ridiculous when you consider where we are now, but we don't actually get there without being a little bit ridiculous and a little bit unreasonable and just dreaming what these changes can be, and then coming back from there and figuring out the exact steps we need to get there.
aside from the stuff that we do, which is really, I feel like, embedded in the industry of like talking to policymakers, begging them to get rid of parking minimums, what can the average person do? And like, what can we as a society do better to move us closer to those things that we are hoping for in that situation of, like where housing is affordable, where housing is social, right? Like, because I feel like we're very insular as an industry. We very much live in a bubble. And then there's like the reality of people who may hear snippets of clickbait titles, but beyond that, and maybe beyond voting, like that's one thing. But what else can we do to like shift our values so that it is more in line with all of the things you described, like walkability, like promoting social connections?
That's a really good question. I do not have a prepared response. Really important, because I think people consistently underestimate the power that they may have within the system. And enough people do that, no one takes action, few people take action, and then you actually like reinforce that reality. But, today we're seeing housing reforms that we've never dreamed of. And it wasn't that long ago when these conversations were considered ridiculous. I remember very clearly talking to an elected official, not in BC, so I can speak to speak to it a little bit freely, and telling him, yeah, we need to like upzone most of our areas around transit, and we need to legalize housing. And he looked at me and he was like, you're a little radical, aren't you? I'm like, and today, like in September, Justin Trudeau in a video said, we need to legalize housing. I could not believe myself but like, that's the reality of consistent advocacy to change things. So talk to people, learn about what your city needs to improve, and be vocal about asking for it. Because once there is an understanding that there's a critical mass of people who will support a change like that, politicians are more likely to swing in that favor and make the moves happen. It's always late. It's always like there's always like built up pressure of people wanting something, and then they'll wait for the right moment to be like, here you go. And we'll be like very happy, but we all know that it's many years too late, but we're happy that it happened. But that's how change builds. So it's not just obviously voting, but it's also talking about it, which is why I love your podcast, Helen.
Thank you. Thanks for the plug. Well, I think that's very hopeful, and I love that. And I think I tend to agree that it feels like there's been a change when it comes to housing, but I never used to follow this stuff like 5 years ago. I will admit, 8 years ago, I didn't even actually used to vote. So yeah, talking about it hopefully helps. And is there anything else that Happy Cities is working on, or that you're working on, that you're excited about, that you want to share?
There is a project that we're working on in a different province than BC as well, but I think it will apply to BC, that is looking at transforming the process of development approvals. Right now, I think we don't realize the ridiculousness of our approvals process and how inefficient it is. Aside, I'm not even talking about the public approvals. I'm not talking about the council or the engagement or the town halls and the 5 days of rezoning. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the process of going from application to council, the process of reviews within the municipalities. Right now, the default in cities is basically review and approve. I provide my drawings, they review it, and they say, okay, and the responsibility is fully on the municipal staffer, whether that's engineering or planning, etc., to say, yeah, this meets our standards, it meets our policies. However, there is a lot that is expected on municipal planners and engineers today. I think far too much. For example, why do engineers need to review other professional engineers' work to determine, for example, the capacity of sewers, traffic, and all these things? We already trust engineers to do pretty life or death things like buildings and skyscrapers. Municipal engineers do not review the foundation and the structural designs of the professional engineers that work in the private sector. The professional engineers design them and they stamp them and they certify and they risk their career on it. And we just assume that they are qualified enough to take that responsibility. However, in much, much less consequential things, we feel the need to review every single application that goes in. So what is a process where more of that responsibility is taken off of the public sector and into professional engineers, professional planners, professional architects to confirm viability and confirm adherence to these standards, and freeing up time for municipal planners to change policy, to come up with, to focus on all the different priorities that they're on, instead of them reviewing I feel really bad for development planners. They have mountains of applications on their desk and not enough resources to do them. Well, how can we actually reduce that load so that they can focus on that truly challenging and complex projects, and they can focus on actually tweaking the policies and the standards, and then their job is, instead of review and approve, it's we trust the engineers, the planners, and the architects that are staking their professional career on these drawings. And we verify every now and then, if you have a good record of complete applications, then we accept things from you right away. And then every now and then we take a sample of your applications and we make sure that you are being honest. And if you're not being honest, that will probably also be your professional career at the cost. So as a professional planner, one would be incentivized to actually be honest. And engineers already do this and it works. And we don't have buildings falling everywhere across the country. So that's one project. I'm really excited about it. Whenever, I don't know how much your listeners will be as excited about it as I am.
I'm excited.
Because it's one of those boring but impactful things.
It is.
There's so many of them in our cities, and it's one of my missions to make the boring things more interesting. They're inherently boring, perhaps, but they're more valued, let's say.
Right. No, I'm excited. And I think anybody who works in the industry would be super stoked that this is happening. You said it's not in BC, so I hope it kind of by osmosis forces BC to do the same. It sounds incredibly...
It's not launched yet. I would have given more specifics.
No, that's okay. That just means it's something good to look forward to. What is the happiest city that you have ever visited or personally experienced?
Okay. That's a hard question because I like different aspects of the cities that I've lived in, and I'm fortunate to have lived in cities that are vastly different. So I grew up in Cairo, then I moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is, as opposite as it can be. The weather is about the same, but I also lived in Glasgow in Scotland. And I lived in Vancouver, of course, and I loved something about each and every one of them. If I had to choose, it would probably be Halifax, because it's where I've chosen to be today. And the reasons for that are so many, because, I talked about this limited interactions, repeated interactions with a limited number of people. And that just happens all the time in Halifax. Halifax is big enough that there are services, there are jobs, there are education, there's things to do and great restaurants and culture, but it's also small enough. When my cousins from Egypt were visiting me and we were walking down the main street, kept bumping into so many people that they were like, "Are you the mayor of Halifax?" But that's the vibe. I was sitting at a library once, just hanging out, and bumped into a friend who I met through Urbanist things, and we just kept talking, and that turned into a project related to pitching ideas for municipal elections. And these ideas included transit improvements, walkability improvements, cycling, all these things. And that person, I ended up becoming one of my best friends. I was the best man in his wedding. From that interaction, which was a chance interaction, we became very close friends. And eventually I hired him to work at Happy Cities. It was my colleague Tristan Cleveland, and we and he helped a lot with these studies. But so for me, it's, when I think about what makes me happy or made me the happiest in the cities that I lived in, it was the community, always and first the community, the family, which for me was very important. And I was fortunate that when we moved from Egypt to Halifax, a lot of my family members moved as well. It's also, I think, if we're kind of come back to describing happiness and actually like breaking down the components of it, it's a sense of meaning and belonging. There is something that we inherently need as humans, is to feel like we are part of something bigger than ourselves, and feeling like the things you are doing on a day-to-day basis actually matter. So, for me, feeling a sense of attachment to my community in Halifax, it makes me want to keep living there, right? It's a vastly different experience living in different parts of Halifax, because I live in a very walkable part of Halifax, and I'm fortunate to be able to do that. Outside of it, our transit system is quite poor. You could easily be stuck in car dependency and have a very different experience living in Halifax. But of course, so for me, that would be my choice. But I can't not think of aspects of it that I loved. Like when I was living in Vancouver, I could live here without a car. I lost a lot of weight just by walking around and taking the bus. And I love buses. I love buses so much. And not everyone says that, but it's because I love the boring things. It's the workhorse of our city. So I love taking the bus. I love biking around. Like, that lifestyle is difficult to replicate in a lot of other North American cities, and Vancouver really excels at that. I love the nature and all of these things. So everything has its benefits. Like Cairo, Egypt ranks fairly low on the happiness ratings for, reasons that are beyond urbanism.
Yeah.
But the neighborhood I grew up in, it was a very happy childhood for me, because everything was near us. All my friends were within, a short walk from me. We actually lived in what is the Middle Eastern version of co-housing, which is an apartment building with all of your family members. It was like a 5-story apartment building. Every single unit in it was family. And we had a common area for us, and we had like an amenity, like and it's very common living, and still to this day, not in the same building, but we live in the same area with all my family members. And that aspect of it is just irreplaceable in terms of, your connection to your community and the amount of people that are there to support you afterwards. So, there's some things from each place, but I think when you start to really dissect what makes you happy in your community, what makes you unhappy, like that is a first step to seeing your city in a different way. I like to say that, like, when I read Charles's book when it came out, the reason why it inspired me so much to work with Happy City, I felt like I could see cities in a different way when I started to understand the impact that urban environments had on us. It's like, it was kind of like, like Neo from the Matrix. Like, I just started to see like everything in the background, and it changed my life. And I emailed Charles and I was like, I don't care what you're doing. I don't care what you pay me. Don't advise that part. But I don't care what you're doing. I don't care what you pay me. I really want to work with you.
Yeah.
And that was almost 10 years ago, and I haven't looked back since.
Right.
So this, yeah, obviously at Happy Cities, we're really passionate about our mission to make cities happier, healthier, and more inclusive. And we think more people should join us on this mission. And we're happy when we see people using words like well-being and happiness into their language. And we're happy when people, even other competitors decide that, like, this is also a core part of our efforts, because this is a tide that lifts all boats. We are all in this together. We're all in these cities together. And the more people can prioritize this and understand it, that's when we will actually have a chance at creating the impact that we dream of.
That's a really beautiful reflection of how you have aligned your values with your happiness and your purpose.
Yeah, I think I'm always going to plug in for Happy Cities, but I'm really fortunate to be part of this team. Everyone is so committed to our mission that, it feels like, you're among friends trying to accomplish something bigger than yourselves. And yeah, it's like, what else could you ask for, So definitely very fortunate to be with this team.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. I learned a lot.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
I love your podcast, and
Thank you.
I know that having these conversations in Metro Vancouver is so important. I look forward to seeing what comes again.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Have we been prioritizing happiness in how we plan and build our cities? Unfortunately, the data seems to say no. Houssam has highlighted that we've been repeatedly planning and building communities that encourage loneliness, while encouraging people to rely on cars. This reduces our social interactions, lengthens our commutes, which in turn creates lonely and less happy cities. If we want to create happier cities, then we have some radical changes to make. We can start by shifting our planning focus from making assumptions for people's needs and wants to instead centering people's experiences and definitions of what makes them happy. This will result in a more challenging and often subjective exercise, but it will create more thoughtful and better outcomes. This will also require policies that are flexible enough to permit that subjectivity. The research has shown that despite diversity in populations and needs, there are common themes to happier cities. These include components like better and more abundant amenities, walkability, and proximity to one's employment, which in turn fosters greater social interactions, trust, better health, and more happiness. But the key to all of these well-intentioned approaches is accountability, which is currently lacking. City planners and builders have unique opportunities to create transformative impact on our communities. However, that also means they have a social responsibility that they should be accountable to. We need to prioritize the value of happiness, measure the performance of this outcome, and be accountable to changing our policies if they no longer support happier, healthier cities. We can all be involved in this change. It may begin with talking about it among friends and family, or providing feedback about our current built environment. We can also ask for accountability from local planning staff and politicians. Happy cities are achievable if we make it a priority. You've been listening to Urbanism Vancouver, the podcast dedicated to bettering our built environment. Be sure to follow us on your listening platform of choice so you don't miss our future releases. I'm Helen Lui. Thanks for listening. This podcast series was independently funded and produced by myself and Aaron Johnson. Visit us at urbanismvancouver.com.